On a sunny afternoon in September 1997, in a suburban park in Denver, Colorado, a 6-year-old boy with tousled blonde hair and wide brown eyes held a red balloon in one hand while carefully scribbling something on a scrap of paper with the other. His name was Ethan, but no one in the park knew that. He was alone. Ethan wrote in shaky, uneven letters, "Please find my parents. I am alone." He folded the note carefully, tied it to the string of the balloon, and with a deep sigh, released. The red balloon floated upward, its bright color a stark contrast against the pale blue sky. It rose higher and higher until it was just a speck in the distance, then disappeared entirely. Ethan stood motionless, staring at the spot where the balloon had vanished. He sat on a bench nearby and waited. The sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, but no one came to find him. As night fell and the air grew colder, the boy disappeared into the silence of the evening. The red balloon traveled across the skies for days, drifting over mountains and plains, carried by the wind. Eventually, it came to rest in a small farming town in Kansas. A curious 13-year-old girl named Lily found it tangled in a fence on her family's property. Intrigued, she untied the note and read the desperate plea, "Please find my parents, I am alone." Her heart sank. She rushed to show the note to her parents, who immediately contacted local authorities. The police tried to trace the origin of the note, but with no last name, address, or other identifying information, their efforts were in vain. The boy who had written it seemed to have vanished without a trace. The note, while heartbreaking, eventually faded into obscurity, a forgotten piece of a much larger mystery. In 2022, 25 years later, Emily Carter, a 28-year-old journalist in Chicago, was sifting through archives for an upcoming feature on unsolved mysteries. She stumbled across an article about the boy's note and the red balloon. The story intrigued her, a boy's desperate plea for help, unanswered for decades. Who was he, and what had happened to him? Emily was determined to find out. She began her investigation by scouring national databases of missing children. After hours of searching, she found something that made her heart race. A boy named Ethan Brooks, aged 6, reported missing from Denver in September 1997. The case was chilling. Ethan's parents, Michael and Sarah Brooks, had been found dead in their home, victims of a violent crime. Ethan, their only child, had disappeared the same day. Emily felt a surge of determination. This was more than a story. It was a chance to uncover the truth about a boy whose voice had been lost for decades. Emily dug deeper into the case, poring over old police reports and archived articles. Michael and Sarah Brooks were described as ordinary people. Michael was a grocery store manager, and Sarah was an elementary school teacher. They had no known enemies, no criminal history, and lived in a quiet neighborhood. Their deaths shocked their community, and the case was widely covered at the time. But the trail had gone cold when Ethan vanished without a trace. Determined to uncover more, Emily traveled to Denver. The Brooks house, abandoned for decades, still stood on the same quiet street, its peeling paint and boarded-up windows giving it an eerie air. Emily gained access to the property with permission from the local authorities. Inside, the house was a shell of what it once was, filled with dust and decay, but she could still sense the echoes of the family that had lived there. In Ethan's old bedroom, Emily found a small stack of forgotten drawings tucked in a cracked dresser drawer. Most were simple pictures of a family, a man, a woman, and a child. But one caught her attention. A crayon drawing of a red balloon with words scrawled next to it. "It will take me to them." She stared at the words, chills running down her spine. Even as a child, Ethan seemed to understand that his balloon was a lifeline. As she examined the room further, Emily discovered something hidden beneath the warped wooden floorboards. It was a crumpled note scribbled hastily, almost as if it had been written in panic. The words read, "Take Ethan. Avoid witnesses. Go to the meeting point." Emily's pulse quickened. This wasn't a random disappearance. It had been planned, armed. With this discovery, Emily delved into police records from the time. The authorities had suspected that Michael Brooks might have been involved with dangerous people, perhaps due to financial troubles. A name kept coming up in the reports: Victor Kane, a local loan shark with a reputation for violence. Kane had been questioned, but never charged in connection with the case. His name had faded from the investigation, but Emily was determined to find him. Her search led her to Kansas, where Ethan's balloon had landed all those years ago. She revisited the church where Ethan had reportedly been left on the steps. The current priest, Father Paul, wasn't there in 1997, but he showed Emily the old records. There it was, a note about a boy, approximately 6 years old, who had been found one morning and taken to a local orphanage. The boy had refused to say much about his past, only repeating, "They're gone," over and over. Emily followed the trail to the orphanage, which had since closed. The dusty records she uncovered revealed the boy had been renamed Ben and was adopted a few months later by a couple in St. Louis, Harold and Linda Evans. With trembling hands, Emily searched for their current whereabouts. Harold had passed away 5 years earlier, but Linda was alive, living in a retirement home in St. Louis. Emily visited Linda, now in her 70s, and explained her investigation. Linda's face softened with recognition when Emily showed her Ethan's photo and the balloon note. She confirmed that Ben was Ethan. He had been a sweet but deeply traumatized boy, prone to nightmares and moments of silence. She and Harold had done their best to give him a loving home, but Ethan had always felt like there was something missing, a past he couldn't fully remember. Emily asked Linda where Ethan was now. Linda smiled and said he was living in New York City, working as a music teacher. Her voice was tinged with pride and sadness. "He always had a gift for music," she said. "It helped him heal, but he still doesn't know everything about where he came from." Emily knew she had to find Ethan and tell him the truth. Emily arrived in New York City with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. She had spent weeks piecing together Ethan's story, but now she faced the most daunting task, confronting the man who had unknowingly lived a life built on half-truths. She tracked him down to the school where he worked, a modest building in Brooklyn with colorful murals painted on its brick walls. She waited outside the school one crisp autumn afternoon, watching as children spilled out, laughing and chattering, followed by a group of teachers. Among them was Ethan. He was in his early 30s, with slightly messy blonde hair and warm brown eyes that still carried a hint of boyish charm. He wore a light blue button-up shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, and carried a leather satchel over one shoulder. He looked peaceful, content even, as he chatted with a colleague. Emily approached cautiously, unsure of how to begin. When she finally called his name, he turned, looking at her with polite curiosity. "Yes?" he said, his voice calm but tinged with uncertainty. "My name is Emily Carter," she began. "I'm a journalist and I believe I've uncovered something about your past. May I speak with you privately?" Ethan hesitated but nodded, gesturing to a small cafe across the street. They sat at a quiet corner table, the hum of espresso machines and soft chatter providing a backdrop. Emily reached into her bag and pulled out the note, the same one he had written as a child and tied to the red balloon. She placed it gently on the table in front of him. Ethan stared at it, his brow furrowing. His hand hovered over the paper before finally picking it up. He read the words slowly, as if they were in a foreign language. This is mine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I remember writing this, but I thought it was just a dream, something I made up." Emily explained everything. She had uncovered the deaths of his parents, his disappearance, and how he had been rescued and adopted. She told him about the crumpled note found in his childhood home and the people who had likely been involved in his family's tragedy. Ethan listened in stunned silence, his expression a mixture of disbelief, pain, and a dawning realization. "They're gone," he murmured, repeating the words he had said as a child. He looked up at Emily. his eyes glassy. I always felt like there was a part of me missing, like there was a hole I couldn't fill. Now I know why. Emily reached out gently. I know this is a lot to process, but I thought you deserved to know the truth, and I think your parents deserve justice. Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening with determination. If there's a way to find out who did this to them, I want to know. I owe them that. Together, they began digging deeper into the details of the case. Emily shared everything she had on Victor Kane, the lone shark who had likely been tied to Michael Brooks. Ethan felt a fire ignite within him as he realized how much his father must have been trying to protect him, even as he got tangled up with dangerous people. Their search led them to Los Angeles, where Victor Kane had been living under the radar. Emily and Ethan managed to track him down to a seedy bar on the outskirts of the city. Ethan waited outside, while Emily went in to confront him. She found Kane sitting alone at a corner table, a man in his 60s with graying hair and a sharp, calculating gaze. "Victor Kane?" Emily said firmly as she approached. He looked up, his expression immediately hardening. "Who's asking?" "My name is Emily Carter. I'm investigating the deaths of Michael and Sarah Brooks, and I believe you know something about what happened to them." Kane's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. Emily continued, "I have a note from their son, Ethan. He was only 6 years old when his parents were killed, and he's been searching for answers ever since. You may have gotten away with this before, but the truth always comes out." Kane leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at his lips. "You think you're the first person to come looking for answers? Let me give you some advice, lady. Some things are better left buried." Emily didn't back down. "You can keep hiding, or you can tell me what you know. Either way, I'm not stopping." Kane's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of unease. After a long silence, he spoke. "Michael Brooks was an idiot. He got himself into trouble he couldn't handle. I sent my guys to rough him up, but things got out of hand. Mason, he's the one you're looking for. He's the one who killed them. I cut ties with him after that." Emily pressed him for more details, but Kane refused to say anything further. Still, it was enough. They had a name, Mason. When Emily left the bar and told Ethan what she had learned, he clenched his fists, his voice trembling with anger. "Mason, I'll never forget that name." Emily placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll find him, and we'll make sure justice is served." Ethan and Emily's next step was to track down Mason, the man Kane had named as the one who killed Michael and Sarah Brooks. It didn't take long for them to find him. Mason was serving time in a maximum security prison in Colorado for an unrelated, violent crime. The thought of confronting the man who had taken everything from him filled Ethan with a mix of dread and determination, but he knew it was something he had to do. They arranged a visit. When Ethan and Emily arrived at the prison, the sterile, imposing walls seemed to reflect the gravity of what they were about to face. Inside the visitation room, Mason was brought to them. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a shaved head and cold, piercing eyes. He sat down across from Ethan and Emily, his hands cuffed to the table. Mason looked at Ethan for a long moment before finally speaking. "You're the boy," he said, his voice gravelly and matter-of-fact. "I knew you'd come around one day." Ethan stared back at him, his jaw tight. "Why?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "Why did you kill my parents?" Mason leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "It wasn't supposed to go that far," he said. "Your dad owed money to Kane. I was sent to scare him, maybe rough him up a little. But he fought back. Things got messy. Your mom got in the way, trying to protect him. It wasn't planned, all right? It just happened." Ethan's fists clenched under the table. "You destroyed my family," he said, his voice trembling. "Do you even care?" Mason shrugged, his indifference cutting deeper than any words could. "It's been 25 years, kid. What's done is done." Emily, sensing Ethan's rising anger, stepped in. "What about Ethan?" she asked, her voice firm. "You left a 6-year-old boy to fend for himself after what you did. Why didn't you hurt him too?" Mason's gaze shifted to Emily, and For the first time, there was a flicker of something that almost resembled guilt. "The boy wasn't part of the deal," he said. "When I saw him, I couldn't do it. I'm not a monster." Ethan's eyes filled with tears, his emotions boiling over. "You think that excuses what you did?" he shouted. "You tore my life apart. You left me with nothing." Mason didn't respond, and the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. After a moment, Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "We're done here," he said, his voice shaking. He turned and walked out, leaving Emily to follow. Outside the prison, Ethan leaned against the car, his hands gripping the roof as he struggled to compose himself. Emily stood nearby, giving him space. After a long silence, Ethan spoke. "I thought hearing the truth would make me feel better," he said. "But it just makes me angrier. My parents are gone because of him, and he doesn't even care." Emily stepped closer. "It's not fair," she said softly. "But you're not that scared little boy anymore, Ethan. You've built a life for yourself, despite everything, and now you've given your parents what they deserved, the truth." Ethan nodded slowly, wiping his eyes. "I want people to know what happened to them," he said. "I want their story to mean something." Over the following weeks, Emily helped Ethan share his story. Her article, titled "The Boy with the Red Balloon," chronicled his journey from that desperate day in the park to uncovering the truth about his parents. The piece was raw and emotional, and it resonated with readers around the country. Messages of support poured in, and the article reignited public interest in unsolved cases of missing children and violent crimes. For Ethan, the support was overwhelming, but healing. People from all walks of life reached out, sharing their own stories of loss and resilience. Slowly, he began to see that his pain had a purpose, that by sharing his story, he was helping others find hope. Emily's article also put pressure on law enforcement to reopen the case. Mason was formally charged with the murders of Michael and Sarah Brooks, ensuring that justice, even decades late, would be served. Victor Kane, too, faced consequences for his involvement, as further investigations uncovered a web of criminal activity that led to his arrest. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a sense of closure, but he knew his journey wasn't over. Ethan began to rebuild his life with a renewed sense of purpose. The overwhelming support he received after Emily's article gave him the courage to take steps he had never considered before. He started speaking publicly about his story, sharing not just the pain of his past, but the strength it took to confront it. Schools, community centers, and advocacy groups invited him to talk about resilience, justice, and the importance of never giving up hope. One day, while sifting through the hundreds of letters and emails he had received from people touched by his story, Ethan came across one that stopped him in his tracks. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, and the letter began with a name he hadn't heard in decades. "Dear Ethan, my name is Lily. I was 13 years old when I found your balloon. It landed on my family's farm in Kansas. At the time, I didn't know how much that note would mean. But now I realize it changed my life. Finding your plea for help taught me about the importance of looking out for others. It stayed with me as I grew up, and today I'm a social worker helping children in crisis. I wanted to thank you for being brave enough to write that note. It didn't just save you, it shaped my life too." Ethan read the letter again, his hands trembling. For years, he had thought of the balloon as a desperate act of survival, something he had done with little hope it would ever matter. Now, he realized it had set off a chain of events that went far beyond himself. He knew he had to meet Lily and thank her for being the first person to hear his cry for help. They arranged to meet at a small cafe in the town where she now worked. When Ethan saw her, he recognized something familiar in her bright eyes and warm smile. Lily, now in her late 30s, greeted him with a mixture of excitement and emotion. "I've been waiting for this moment for a long time," she said as they sat down. "I always wondered what happened to you." Ethan smiled. "You're the reason I'm here today," he said. "You may not have known it at the time, but finding that balloon started everything. You gave me a chance." Lily wiped a tear from her cheek. "And you've done so much with it. Your story has inspired so many people, including me." The two spent hours talking, exchanging memories, and filling in the gaps of each other's lives. Ethan learned about Lily's childhood and how finding the balloon had given her a sense of purpose that eventually led her to her career. She, in turn, listened intently as Ethan recounted the journey that had brought him to this moment. Before they parted, Lily took his hand. "You've turned something tragic into something beautiful," she said. "Your parents would be so proud of you." Ethan returned home feeling lighter, as though another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. He began working with organizations that supported children who had experienced trauma, using his platform to raise awareness and funds. His story was adapted into a documentary, which brought even more attention to his mission. Every time he stood on stage or in front of a camera, he thought of the boy he had been, the boy who had written that note and sent it into the unknown, hoping against hope that someone would care. On the 25th anniversary of the day, he released the balloon. Ethan returned to the park where it had all begun. He stood under the same tree, holding another red balloon. This time, the note tied to it wasn't a cry for help. It was a message of gratitude. "To my parents, Michael and Sarah, thank you for everything. I will never forget you." Ethan let go, watching as the balloon rose into the sky, carried by the wind, just as the first one had been. He stayed there until it was out of sight, a small red dot disappearing into the vast blue. As he turned to leave, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. He had found closure, not just for himself, but for his parents, whose lives were finally honored and whose story was finally told. And in doing so, he had found a new purpose, to help others rise above their own pain, just as he had. Ethan's life continued to evolve in ways he never could have imagined. The boy who had once felt forgotten and alone was now a symbol of hope for countless others. His story reached across borders and generations, inspiring people to confront their own struggles and seek closure where they thought it was impossible. Emily remained by his side, not just as a journalist, but as a close friend and confidant. Together, they co-authored a book titled The Boy with the Red Balloon, which became a bestseller. The book chronicled Ethan's journey in vivid detail, from his desperate act of releasing the balloon to uncovering the truth about his parents. It was raw, emotional, and deeply moving. Readers from all over the world wrote letters to Ethan, sharing how his story had touched them. One letter stood out above the rest. It was from a young boy in a small town in California. He wrote, "Dear Mr. Ethan, I'm 9 years old and my parents fight a lot. Sometimes I feel scared and lonely. My mom read me your story, and it made me feel like I'm not alone. I hope I can be as brave as you one day." Ethan kept that letter on his desk as a reminder of why he continued to share his story. It wasn't just about his own healing anymore. It was about giving others the courage to face their pain and find hope. Emily's book was later adapted into a documentary that won several awards. The film's success brought even more attention to Ethan's advocacy work. He partnered with organizations focused on helping children in crisis, using his platform to raise awareness and funds. Every time he spoke at an event, he felt his parents' presence, as though they were guiding him. One evening, Ethan received a call from Lily. She had just watched the documentary and wanted to thank him again. "You've created something truly extraordinary," she said. "You've turned a tragedy into a legacy that will last forever." Ethan smiled, humbled by her words. "I couldn't have done it without you," he replied. "You were the first person who cared enough to listen." On the anniversary of the book's release, Ethan, Emily, and Lily reunited in Denver. They visited the park where the balloon had been released all those years ago. This time, they were surrounded by supporters, people whose lives had been touched by Ethan's story. Together, they released dozens of red balloons into the sky, each one carrying a message of hope, love, or remembrance. As Ethan watched the balloons rise, he reflected on how far he had come. His journey had been filled with pain and loss, but it had also brought him strength, connection, and purpose. He had found a way to honor his parents, not just by uncovering the truth, but by living a life that would have made them proud. Before leaving the park, Ethan looked up at the sky one last time. "Thank you," he whispered, his words carried by the wind, and with that, he walked away, ready to face whatever came next. The story of Ethan, the boy with the red balloon, reminds us that even in our darkest moments, there is light to be found. It is a testament to resilience, the power of human connection, and the enduring impact of hope. Ethan's journey showed the world that no matter how lost we feel, there is always a way to rise again. Ethan moved forward, but he never forgot his roots. He continued to inspire people around the world, showing that sometimes the greatest strength comes from facing one's own fears and transforming pain into purpose. If you enjoyed this heartfelt story, subscribe to The Golden Love Stories channel to hear more narratives like this. Stories that touch, inspire, and show the best of humanity. See you next time.